Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Leadership Now with me, Dan Pontefract, in the house today. My friend Thomas, going to get to Thomas's full bio, and then we'll get into some serious framing, reframing, and other bits. Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg. Thomas is a globally recognized expert on innovation and problem solving. His latest book, What's Your Problem? Published by Harvard Business Press, was recommended by former Google CEO Eric Schmidt with the words, "If you want the superpower of solving better problems, read this book." That's quite an attribution. This book is published in 14 different languages. Well done, my friend. His research has been featured in The Economist, Forbes, Bloomberg, Business Week, and the Financial Times. HR Magazine listed him as a top 20 international thinker, and Thinkers 50 listed him on their 2021 radar. Thomas holds an MA in Media Science from the University of Copenhagen and an MBA from IESE Business School. Prior to his business career, Thomas served 4 years as an officer in the Danish Royal Guards. His first book, Innovation as Usual, was published by Harvard Business Press, sharing how to make innovation happen in big organizations. As an executive advisor and keynote speaker, Thomas has addressed organizations everywhere, such as Cisco, Microsoft, Citigroup, Time Warner, Caterpillar, Amgen, the list goes on. Thomas, it's so good to see you. We're going to have some fun over the next little bit here. Now, let's get to it. You suggest, ultimately, my friend, that the way people frame a problem actually determines which solutions they come up with. So if we are doing so in that kind of introductory statement by shifting the way people see a problem, which is ultimately the reframing bit that you get at, so they can find radically better solutions, I'm interested, first of all, can you help the audience understand the importance of framing? And then the follow-up is, well, why do we have to get better at it?
It really comes down to the difference between framing and analysis. So I think if you're an amateur problem solver, you make the mistake of jumping very quickly to the solution. Amateurs, moderate that a bit because some professionals do it too.
Right.
Once you've gotten a little bit more experience, you kind of start to understand the importance of like pausing, of saying, wait, what's the problem we're solving here? Before you jump into action or commit yourself to a specific course. Now, that's where the interesting thing happens, because even for the people who are taking a step back and saying, wait, what's the problem? They conflate analysis with framing. And the example I use all the time to share this is the old story of an office building where the tenants are complaining about the speed of the elevator. Now, if you're trying to solve that problem, you can start to ask, why is the elevator slow? But that actually traps you in the first framing of the problem. So you could do a very careful analysis of the wrong problem. And an experienced landlord might suggest that you instead put up a mirror next to the elevator, because the issue isn't necessarily that it's slow, it's that people hate waiting. And there's nothing better than a mirror to make people like fall in love with their own reflection and forget that they're waiting and so on. So that really encapsulates that crucial distinction between getting trapped in analysis versus taking a step back and saying, wait, the problem we're looking at, is that necessarily the problem we should be focused on? As to the importance, I think it's almost evident from that example. Way too often we jump in, we spend endless time on analyzing or acting on the wrong problems. Or maybe we just focus on, it's not the wrong problem, but there's just a much better solution out there. We go out and buy new elevators, which is expensive, instead of testing whether the mirror might solve the problem. So it's such a basic thing. And it is, to me, insane that we're not better at doing this, given the impact it can have if somebody's good at understanding what problem to solve.
Well, so, okay, I'm with you. You had me at hello, my friend, but the things that are getting in the way of it. So is it conflation? Is it we're so busy? Is it we don't know how to pause? Like, I want to get deep into what's getting in the way of this sort of thinking?
Yeah. I point to two things. One is just the how-to skill. And I've noticed, so this is kind of old research. And most people, if you ask them, they know the importance of kind of studying the problem carefully. They can quote that kind of fake Einstein quote about if I had an hour to solve the problem and so on. But they don't actually have the skills of how to do it, which is one reason in the book that I kind of structured it as you can actually work through real problems in order to learn the method, not just to understand it. The other factor, I think that's the most interesting one, because before we joined here, we spoke briefly about the importance of time. When I asked, we've had the research on this, the first empirical studies on this, that's been that harks back to the 60s. So how come we are in now 2024 and it's still a big missing link? Well, I think one of the pitfalls we've fallen into is to believe it has to take a lot of time. There is this perception that, we have to now study the problem carefully. Well, we need to go 2 weeks into the mountains and think deep thoughts, and then we can come down with a proper framing of the problem. That's super dangerous, because that means you might only use it on one out of, the biggest problem you have, you might use it on if you have the opportunity, but then the hundreds of problems we deal with every day, that's just not an option. And so one of the central things, the work springs out of a workshop I've kind of developed, or a method, is actually to teach people how to do it in 5 minutes. And that sounds insane, but if you can build your skill in this, to do it that rapidly, that means you can use it everywhere. You can use it in a problem that, you're in the hallway, a colleague comes by with an issue, and you can very quickly at least try to pressure test their understanding of the problem and maybe guide them in the right direction. So I think it's those two things, like the how-to skill we haven't built and this perception that it has to take a lot of time.
So what's your problem, Thomas? I mean, at the end of the day, do you think that people's what's your problem is, and leaders in particular, is that they've sort of taken, well, you'll know this, like Dr. Igor Ansof's work on paralysis by analysis, and said, every single problem that we need to reframe now is your opportunity to sit on a fence and to sit there stuck so that no decisions and no movement forward gets made. Do you think that there's a whole cadre of leaders that are stuck thinking, well, every chance we get to reframe is actually a chance for paralysis by analysis? That means we're not going to make any money, we're not going to make any progress, and we're up in the mountains, as you've mentioned, right? Ultimately rethinking or reframing a problem. So is that part of the problem with the problem?
It is, and I think you outlined this beautifully in your book, Open to Think. But like that the spectrum between like jumping too quickly into action, having no reflection, and then that what you're referring to, the Ansoff stuff around paralysis by analysis, where, we start writing long PhD theses about the problem and nothing happens. And I mean, this is one of your points as well, but kind of understanding that this is an iterative process. When you master doing it quickly, it also means that you can actually, let's say you have a problem, and instead of thinking you have to define it carefully, completely upfront, maybe you start Monday morning by having a round of kind of, let's see if we frame this correctly. Then you do stuff during the week. And then maybe next Monday you come back and say, okay, given who we spoke to and what we did last week, do we still understand the problem correctly? Are there new angles here to surface on it? Is it what we think it is? Are there better approaches to it? And I think that's the way to resolve it. I'd be curious, what would you add to that?
Well, I would say to this that there's a cycle. And again, you bring this up in the book, right? It's ultimately a cycle of what I'm using as this creative, critical, applied thinking, where we dream, decide, do, repeat. And there are incursion points or reflection points or pivot points where you're like, wow, let's go back and learn what we learned here, or bring what we learned from over here. And so that it's a constant reframing exercise is business and is life. The fact that people think that you got to sit on that fence, so to say, or go up in the mountains to think or reframe, all of a sudden the business stops. Like, come on, like it's nonsense.
It still baffles me. When I started writing the book, I was kind of like, why hasn't this been done before? It doesn't make sense that I can make a living teaching this to companies at the moment. I shouldn't be capable of that. This is stuff that we should learn, if not in university or school, then at least in your first or second, job or promotion.
Right.
It's insane.
Yeah. Well, let's not kill your career. Let's make sure that we're still trying to help people. Now, another term that you've come up with in the book, which I loved, is the law of the hammer. And basically, you're saying that leaders tend to frame problems, or people tend to frame problems, so they match, one's preferred solution. It's like your own bias for the right answer, or the right outcome, and you're completely blinded by anything else that might be opportunistic. So, elaborate on the law of the hammer, and then go from there.
It's the original creation of I think both Abraham Maslow and another academic, Abraham Kaplan, came up with it. And your listeners have heard this one. Like if you give a child a hammer, they're going to see everything as a nail.
Yeah.
Now here's a nuance in that. I think we have hammers. We each have our own hammers because we have experienced that they work pretty well for many of our problems. So it's not necessarily wrong to kind of reach out for your default solution the first time you're taking a crack at a problem. That can probably maybe be the most efficient thing you could do. What's wrong is when it then doesn't work to try to hammer harder. And that's what I see all the time. Like there's like, oh, okay, our marketing campaign didn't hit the spot. Maybe we should just put more money into it. And there is that danger of getting so used to the hammer that you don't notice that you're not facing a hammer problem anymore, or with whatever you're dealing with. I think that's the essence of it. The hammer's not bad, but you have to understand what it doesn't work for.
And it sort of lends to a point that you also have pointed out, I'm sure you do in your consulting, your workshops, et cetera. And that is, how do leaders figure out a way in which to get out of their own expertise and bias? Like they really have to develop a muscle, which is, well, I'm the leader, I know the best, or I'm the leader, I'm in charge of reframing. Like there's something there that you do touch on that I think leaders need to understand and learn.
One of the you've like over the last decade plus, we have seen a ton of popular science kind of excavations of biases. Like for a number of years, you could build your career in academia by finding a new bias of some sort. I think the central thing about biases, the one thing that stands out is even if you are aware of your biases, they're very, very hard to overcome. And the wonderful thing is there's a shortcut, namely to involve other people. Like you can't really easily supersede your own biases, and we all have them, but you can develop the simple practice of involving your team and potentially other people when you're trying to define the problem. Not just when you get to, oh, here's what I want to do, now let me get buy-in for the solution, but at that early stage when you are even trying to understand what's going on. Oh, are people in our company, they aren't innovating? Why is that? Like, can we, is it just because they don't know how, or something else going on? So the central thing I think is this is not just an individual skill. It assumes its full power when you can share it with a couple of people that you work with on a regular basis, and it becomes a group habit, if you will.
Couldn't say anything better than it being a group habit, because you do come up with a process that's both simple but full of depth. And so that is the frame, reframe, move forward mantra that you have. And so framing is, well, what are we trying to solve? What's the problem? Reframing is there a different way to see this particular problem? And of course, move forward is, well, how do we keep momentum? So it's simple, it's powerful, but unpack it for us, so that we understand its importance. But then obviously, most importantly, is how to implement this to make it one of those group habits.
Yeah. I as an aside, I would have loved to say, well, your framework is simple and quite shallow. So that's like, I'm Danish, so we have a weird self-deprecating form of humor. It's kind
yes, you do.
So the 3 steps: frame, reframe, move forward. The framing is really about stating the problem separately from the solution you have in mind. Very often you see people kind of presenting a solution in the guise of a problem. And this is just about making sure that those 2 things are separate. So the very first thing you do when you have a problem, you literally write down as a full sentence what that problem is. Like, my father is really annoying, or my team is dysfunctional, or whatever it is you're dealing with. And you're trying to put some words on it. Now that framing becomes your raw material for questioning your own understanding of what it is. And as we just touched on, that's best done with other people. So ideally, you might gather a couple of other people and ask them to challenge your way of thinking, given the problem. They're trying to kind of kick the tires of how you see the problem. I share in the book some strategies for how to do that, how to get better at doing it fast, and we can potentially delve into that a little bit later, some of them. But the final step of that process, which comes back to this issue of not getting stuck in like getting paralyzed by analysis, is to figure out how do we then move forward. It's not necessarily a solution. It might be something as simple as how do we even validate whether this is really the problem? And that's anything from you can prototype, you can have conversations with people, lots of ways to do that. But fundamentally, that cycle makes sure that you don't get stuck the last part of moving forward. So that's in a nutshell, that's what it's about.
And so it leads me somewhat, obviously, perhaps, right, to start saying, well, how come it's not systemic? Like, what's the resistance? What are the resistors that get in the way of something so, it's certainly not shallow, Thomas, but certainly something so simplistic, but affirming as to why it works is frame, reframe, move forward. So there's resistors, though. So why are there, or what are they, I guess, first? And then let's sort of help people see how you can unstuck yourself from a frame, reframe, move forward mantra.
We've covered like two of the reasons for resistance already, which is not having the practice or the skill, and then the time issue. But I think there's probably another one, and this is something that really only surfaced for me actually after writing the book. The role of psychological safety. I assume all of your listeners are familiar with Amy Edmonds's work on that. But there is something about what kind of culture do you have in your team? Are people comfortable, if you're the boss, of saying, hey, I think you might be wrong about this thing? And a couple of ways forward on that, I would say, one small building block. If you can't get to a point of getting full psychological safety with your entire team, well, can you get at least one colleague feel comfortable enough to kind of to oppose you behind the scenes? So they might come up after the meeting and say, hey, Thomas, you're a bit of a jerk just now. And by the way, I think you're totally wrong. Like whatever you can do to at least get one other person to that point before, if you can't manage to get your full team to do it. The other aspect of that is to understand, this is something I cover in the book too, around what can you do when people push back, when there's a more senior person who doesn't want to listen to your, they just pulled you into solve it, they don't want to hear about the problem. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. The fundamental thing you have to decide is whether you do it over or under the radar, meaning do you try to convince them that it's a good idea to spend time on problem diagnosis, perhaps by sharing a different story from a different client that makes them see the importance? Or do you have to do it under the radar? So one person I write about in the book, Chris Dame, he comes into a company, he realizes that the client team has the wrong diagnosis, but they're not open to discussing that. So he just says, I love to just kind of get a better understanding of this by interviewing some of your people anonymously. And based on that, he then comes back and puts some evidence in front of them, anonymized, that kind of highlights what you think is the problem is actually not the problem. So there are some ways of dealing with the social dynamics of this. Either, create more psychological safety even with one person, or use some of kind of like the stealth tactics for making it happen even if you face resistance.
There's quite a nice parallel as well, Thomas, to the work that you did on aligning goals, and ultimately when different people have different thoughts on what the goal may be, how do you reframe the goal? The example with Egypt and Israel and President Jimmy Carter back in 1978 is a pretty good one. But are there kind of ways in which you can help us see the importance of the reframing of the goal so that it helps you with this process?
The goal is so important because, like, if you look at the research on this, for instance, Paul Knott from Ohio State University, who studied, I think it's more than 400 real life problems or decisions.
Mm-hmm.
It was very clear that if you don't specify the goal fairly early on, your chances of getting it right decreases dramatically. Like, you have to understand what a good outcome looks like in order to optimize your chances of getting it right. What I'm adding to that is that you can actually also rethink the goal. It's not just about clarifying it. It's also about questioning what, could success look differently from what we have in mind right now? I can't help sharing this because I love it, but the story I describe about the boss from hell. So it's a leader in I think it's in the automotive industry. This is an old story from Robert Sternberg. And he loves his job, loves his company, but has a boss that he utterly despises. It's just like a terrible person to work with. At least their dynamic is not great. And he comes back to his wife and says, "I gotta get out of this." And he reaches out to a headhunter, an executive search firm, and the headhunter says, "Oh yeah, sure, we can totally, like, there's so much demand in this industry right now. If you want a job in a different company, I'll find that for you." Then though, the wife comes in and says, "That's one way of thinking about success, you getting out of the company. But maybe we could rethink what success looks like." And here's what happens according to Sternberg. The next day, the leader goes back to the headhunter. He hands him his boss's CV and says, "Can you find a job for this guy?" And according to Sternberg, that's what actually happens. Like, the boss gets headhunted somewhere else, and the leader gets promoted into the old boss's role, staying with the company he loved. So I love that story because I'm sure nobody can relate to the experience of having had a bad boss. But it also exemplifies that notion that A, do you know what your goal is? And B, could you rethink what your goal is? Is there a different way to win from the one you're currently focused on, so to speak?
Well, and you've segued into another line I wanted to get into quite nicely, and that is you emphasize as well that a leader's almost fiduciary responsibility is to take other people's perspectives, in so much as that's a continuous learning culture. So if this is an excellent leadership habit to uphold, what strategies do you recommend leaders should be employing to foster the practice of listening and gathering other people's perspectives?
I think we have some of the basics pretty well established. So, like, most companies nowadays, if they're kind of trying to track in this, they might use something like user journeys or different design thinking tools or whatnot. I think the most interesting nuance or maybe a pitfall that people run into there is really to misunderstand or to confuse your preferences with theirs. So I'll share a very simple example. I, at one point, taught my reframing workshop to a bunch of kids that were 5, 6, and 7 years old.
Wow.
And as part of that, a friend of mine runs an elementary prep school north of New York. And as part of that, I asked the kids to pick a problem that they were facing and having them discuss and try to reframe that with some of their peers. This is a fascinating exercise because when I ask adults, "So what problems do you think the kids had?" they mention stuff like, well, the iPad, not enough time with that, bedtime, I have to go to school, and all of that stuff, right? And what they don't realize, the adults answering this, is that they are responding with their own problems. They are trying to understand what problems do a kid have. So they're trying to focus on somebody else, but they bring in their own baggage. If your biggest issue with your son is that he doesn't want to go to bed and when it's time to turn off the iPad, then you think that's his biggest problem too, and that's wrong. So the problems that the kids actually had that came up in that session had nothing to do with parents. It was all about brothers, sisters, somebody at school who was bullying them, a friend who was being difficult, or whatever. It's about their peers. It was about relationships. It was not about stuff. Which, let's face it, that's great news. Like, it means as parents, they have accepted that we're evil dictators. They're okay with it. Awesome. Yeah. But that basic thing, when you're trying to take somebody else's perspective, of actually stepping away from your own preferences. Johannes Hattler, who's done research on this, found that it is enough to literally just remind people of that, to literally say, hey, remember, when you're trying to understand our customers, don't bring your own interests and preferences into that. Try to focus on what they are interested in. And on top of that, see.
So you've alluded to earlier, like several biases, and you also came up with this notion of a confirmation bias. So do you believe that our own kind of leader confirmation bias is one of the barriers to getting into the cycle? So if a leader is confirmed, it's kind of like, being in the room and saying, I'm the smartest person. But if we don't accept that confirmation bias, or that we have a tendency to confirm our own bias, let's say, what advice do you give to leaders so they can minimize that confirmation bias impact in the process of whether it's that goal? Like the point you just made out with the kids is a great one, because there's a apparent confirmation bias that they thought that, the problems are them, or the problems are about themselves, etc. So I wanted to delve a little deeper into this one.
Yeah, I think it comes back to identity. In the sense that, or maybe a role perception, when you think of yourself and what your job isn't necessarily the person to come up with the bright ideas and find the answer. What I would argue, and that this kind of harks back to my earlier book, Innovation as Usual, that you mentioned at the beginning. In that one, me and my co-author, Patty Miller, we draw a distinction between being an innovator and being what we call an innovation architect. And that simply means somebody who creates the space for others to be innovative in. It's like the core job of the leader, if you ask me, is to create results through other people. And that applies here too, I think. It's really about recognizing that in the meeting, when you are facing a problem, your role might not be to solve it if you're a leader. Your role might be to create a space with your team and literally manage the 5-10 minutes where you go in and say, hey, folks, give me some thoughts on how we see this problem and what do you think is going on here. So that shift, going in and understanding what your role is. There's a point at which, as you ascend, that you can no longer hope to solve all the problems, that you're just going to bottleneck yourself and your team if you take that stance. Would you add something to that? Like, this is also something you've been looking at.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is coming down for me, right? The tone, the culture, the connection points, the ways in which that a team, what I call team norms, or even organizational norms, like when there is that the safety that you alluded to psychologically, but just really like basic stuff like trust. So if you've got an untrustworthy culture that's fiefdoms, it's silos, it's us against them. A lot of either the goal reframing or just the reframing when you're post framing becomes very troublesome, becomes very bad friction-esque, and you don't wind up solving anything, and it just becomes the bureaucracy sort of sets in. Fair?
Almost matches your distinction between jump into action too quickly and kind of paralysis by analysis.
Yeah.
When it comes to trust, there's a similar spectrum, because I found it's great to have people you trust, and if you can build that, awesome. But there is a danger of relying on people you trust, because if you look at the research on who we tend to become friends with, who we tend to establish bonds of trust with, it comes down to being similar. You can see this wonderfully on dating sites. One of the best predictors of whether you're going to have a good first date is whether you like the same music. It's kind of like, oh, you're also into Norwegian death heavy metal? Awesome. We should go out.
For example.
What I found is, when it comes to getting outside perspectives on your problem, you can actually benefit from involving people that you don't know as well. Like, I'm not saying, don't share a sensitive problem with somebody you actually distrust. That's probably a bad idea. But actually trying to reach out and pulling somebody in, I don't know. I had a interesting case. I had a lawyer senior partner in his company, and they were trying to kind of solve a long-term problem. And they had the issue that they were always talking about it amongst the partners, but nobody did anything about it, because the second the meeting ended, everybody went back to focusing on snatching the next client. What changed was he brought in one of his really talented younger folks who had not yet made partner. And it was actually her that started, she took the first steps to making the longer term project happen. Why did she do that? Well, partially, of course, he brought her in, but also because when you are a younger associate in a law firm, you're very keen on trying to impress the partners. And so you might find a little bit of extra time to do something they're not doing for themselves. So very simple example, but kind of that idea of involving people, not just your usual trust mafia, but if maybe somebody who's a step outside of that as well. That can help.
Okay, while I still have you, a couple more questions. I wanted to get your thoughts, Thomas, on denial. So when the team or the leader or both, like what happens when people are denying that there's a problem and they don't want to go into a reframing exercise, so to say? What should we be doing?
I tend to shift it from a conversational thing to an experiential thing, meaning if you can't convince them verbally, well, can you bring something in that does it for them? Like, can you bring a third party into the discussion? I don't know, if you're in a pharmaceutical company, you're discussing patients, can you get permission to show some video footage of patients talking about whatever thing it is? And that can make people realize, oh, they don't actually care about the thing we thought they care about. They have a different focus. Can you bring other people into the room? Or can you do, as the Chris Dame experience I shared earlier, is there some other kind of evidence you can bring in? Wonderful story on that. This is an old story actually from Chris Dame about early days of building computers. And this team of engineers, they were building the case for the computer, and they had to also have an exhaust vent. And then an external consultant kind of realizes, you know what? The floppy drive and the exhaust vent look pretty similar. I think users can confuse this. The engineers go, what kind of idiot would confuse that? No, you're wrong. And then the consultant comes back next time with a video recording of the company's CEO trying to stuff a floppy disk into the exhaust drive. Very beautiful demonstration of the fact that maybe the engineers were wrong about this. That's a little bit in your face, of course, but that kind of stuff can work. Your key job is to figure out, if people are in denial, what can I bring in? Can I do something experiential that might make them change their mind?
Well, and it also reminds me, you bring in, this kind of dichotomy between the fixed theory to the working hypothesis theory, or I guess mindset, really, that requires flexibility. So it almost sounds like we've got to start teaching teams how to be flexible with this working hypothesis model as opposed to being fixed. So is that helpful? And if so, unpack that for me.
It comes back to this is something our fellow acquaintance Roger Martin writes about. This is a geologist back in the 1890s, I think, Thomas Chamberlain, who says when you are working on something, you shouldn't just have a theory, a hypothesis about what it is, because if you have it, you'll fall in love with it. You should, as fast as possible, develop multiple different potential explanations for what you're seeing. The act of doing that, of kind of broadening your portfolio of explanations, has been proven to dramatically increase your chances of getting it right. So that thing, this is also where reframing, of course, comes into the picture. Can you, when you have a problem, quickly come up with 2 or 3 different explanations for why it might happen? If your kids are impossible, is it only because, they're just impossible? Or is something else going on that might involve your behavior or a third thing you don't know about yet? So basic thing, working hypothesis, develop multiple of those.
But you also, Thomas, make mention that we should be analyzing our past. So whether by past events or systemic factors, right? You're saying, look, you do have to pick up the tuition value of your past in order to move forward with an advanced degree in reframing. So is that fair? And again, how do we do some of that?
I think that's very fair. And I think it's a mistake to think that people come in as blank slates when they arrive at a problem. Very often they actually have something lurking in the back of their heads that can help. And all it can take sometimes is a conversation or trying to focus on it that can suddenly retroactively make you understand what's going on. I share one example there of there's a couple that fought a lot about their budget, like Tanya and Brian. And then they're trying first to understand what's going on. They think, it's because we're from different countries and we're married and like blah, 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 or it's because my husband is an idiot. And then at one point, Tanya actually notices a bright spot, a positive exceptions, namely a discussion they had about the budget, the sore topic, which went flawlessly. And she realized it was because they had that discussion in the morning. All other discussions tended to happen after 10 at night, where everybody was tired and cranky. And so the conflicts became fights. She instigated the rule that they call the 10 o'clock rule in their marriage. They're still married. And it's basically that if something contentious come up after 10, we take it the next morning. And she credits that with solving 80% of their conflicts. So super simple thing. Trying to think about your past and seeing how that can maybe help you rethink what's going on.
Right. And the goal is stay married and be flourishing and thriving as a couple, as opposed to freaking out and having, bad pillow fights at post 10 o'clock at night. Yeah. Well done. This has been fascinating. I could probably chat with you more, but we're going to hold off and have another chat later on because I'd love to delve even further into some of the work that you continue to do. Thomas, where can people find out more about you and obviously the book, What's Your Problem?
Thomas Wedell, my surname.com, or howtoreframe.com if you want to delve into the book itself. That's probably the best starting points. Or if you want to delve into some of the innovation architect stuff, that was called Innovation as Usual, also Harvard Business Press.
And what are you up to? So ultimately, when people think about Thomas Wedell, tell me a bit about what you bring services-wise to potential clients.
A lot of what I do right now is focused on this because, as you well know, companies have problems, and they apparently find it helpful to bring me in to kind of not just teach the method, but also sometimes just go in and help them with the process of reframing or understanding the challenges they're facing. So that's a lot of the stuff I do. I'm trying to figure out with my next book whether it should be about kind of the work you and I do, which is to say, there's so many books, there's so much stuff out there, and some of it stands out. Why is that? Like, what is it about if you're interested about becoming an expert in your area? Dory Clark, by the way, does great work about this. One of our shared acquaintances. Like, what does it actually? Is there a way to recognize what a really interesting idea is versus maybe, compared to all of the uninteresting ideas that are out there? There's thousands of books being published every week or every day, I think. Why do some of them really have an impact? That's kind of what I'm messing around with. And I'm in that painful stage of figuring out whether it should be a book or not. So you've written a few as well. So maybe that's something we should delve into too.
Possibly I have books that people didn't need either. So I could learn from you and the work that you do as I think about my next book, because genuinely speaking, I'm a masochist as a book writer.
That helps.
Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg, it has been just a true joy hanging out with you today here on Leadership Now. Thanks for this. Thanks for the book, What's Your Problem? I look forward to the next one. If I can contribute and help, you know where to ring me up at. Look forward to our next chat. And thanks again, Thomas.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. And thanks to your listeners as well.
That's been another episode of Leadership Now with me, Dan Pontefract, everyone. Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg, genuinely one of the nicest people I know, but one of the greatest thinkers I know as well. And, not a bad Dane, too. Thanks, all.